Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Treasure Coast Solutions every Wednesday from 9 to 10 o'clock. We talk about some of the economic issues, some of the things that are happening nationwide, locally, and internationally that may impact you here in Stewart. Some of the things that you maybe want to be concerned about, maybe some of the things that you want to be aware of. It's not a financial planning show or an investment show, but it is an opportunity to think about some things that maybe have an impact on your income or on your financial situation, and kind of just talk about some of the basic principles of um, of economics and business that that maybe some people haven't been exposed to. And that's the thing I've found is that it's a lot of times in a lot of areas, but particularly in economics, people don't get a very significant education or exposure to economic theory, and it's probably because it's boring and nobody wants to listen to it or hear it. But and sometimes when you get it in high school, it's an elective class sometimes maybe, or something that you just, you decide to pick up. Sometimes people don't take it because it affects their, it might not be an AP class, or it might not be a dual enrollment class where they get extra credit for it. So, and it may affect their grade point. And so, there's a lot of reasons why people don't take economics. And then when they do take it, even at that high school level, I think sometimes it's hard for a 16-year-old or 17-year-old or even an 18-year-old to really understand all of the things that go into some of this macroeconomics in particular, and but even micro, because they don't. Micro is the this is the study of more the study of business, more of the study at the uh, at the individual level, and macro is more the study of overall government type, the overall economic theory, the things like gross national product, gross domestic product, and things like that, how the governments work. And micro is how business, kind of business economics. And so, if you haven't had a lot of exposure to that, some of that stuff can be extremely confusing. And what makes it worse is that it is it's an observational. It really is, to some degree, an observational science, uh, and it because it's done in the real world, it's hard to take away the variables. And so, what I mean by that is, if you've done any kind of scientific testing, there's a couple things that you do in those in scientific testing. One is you try to isolate the thing that's being tested, so that you can specifically focus on that item, that cell, that disease, that whatever it is, and you kind of just look at that, and you isolate it and don't look at other things, and you don't allow other things to contaminate your site, so that you don't have multiple things going on. And then you actually do certain things to see if you get a result, and what result you get. And and once you have been able to repeat that exercise, and you've been able to repeat the results, then you can feel and you can feel pretty comfortable that your theory, your hypothesis, is correct. All right. And that's the key in medicine, science, and that is to test, and then to independently have someone else test using the same process, the same theory, the same method, and come up with the same answer. And um, and to try to and as much as possible, you test and retest and retest. But in economics, it's not easy the test is a real world test, and there's no way to specifically isolate the activity. And frankly, many of the activities take place over 100 years, and so they may you may get to see it twice or three times over 100-year period of time, and there are always kind of different things going on there historically. So a lot of times when we look at economic theory and we look at economic uh, uh, testing, it's it's done with a somewhat of a eye towards history, what was going on in history at the time. And it's very hard because sometimes it's a chicken and egg type thing. For example, I'll give you an example of that. The There's a lot of uh, there's a lot of thought um, that a number of wars that we were involved in were as a result of taxes, that taxes were not as a result of the war. So, for example, um, in the case of in the case of uh, uh, Lincoln, President Lincoln, he was a no taxer, and he was being opposed even within his own party, and that's frankly why under some of the conspiracy theories, if you want to call them that, that the thought was that it was people in his own party that were behind his assassination, um, and it was not necessarily because of his position relative to slavery, but rather his position regarding taxes and and what some people thought would give the South an advantage, or in his case, it would have created a situation where, uh, and remember that at the time there was the Whig Party, so he was the first Republican, I think, first Republican president. So anyway, you had this theory that it was as a result of his tax position that resulted in the war, not kind of the war resulted in taxes, but regardless of that, that's just one situation that is very hard to analyze after the fact because of all of the things that were going on and the different things that were happening. So when you look at the economics, you'll look at the history, and a lot of times it gets messed up, it gets mixed in, and it's confusing. Uh, when you look at macroeconomics and some of the things that are happening to gross domestic product, gross national product, when you're in a war, that's kind of a different situation. So, sometimes when we look at what happened in World War I, World War II, it's hard to say, was it the economic policy that created the was it the economic policy at the time that created the stimulus, or was it the war that created the stimulus? And you know, jobless was the jobless. I mean, during the war, during World War II, we basically had full employment. Why? Because we had sent all of our young men overseas to fight, and that wiped out most of the working population, which was younger there anyway. The age, your maximum age was a lot younger in World War II in terms of your maximum lifespan. So we sent a lot of the high earning power workers at the time to fight a war, and then that opened up a lot of jobs because we needed to produce different things, metals and everything else for the war effort. And so we hired a lot of women who weren't typically in the workforce at that time. But it was their patriotic duty, and they did that, and they joined, and they started working. Now all of a sudden, you had above what was considered at the time to be full unemployment because women weren't considered in the workforce at the time. And so you know was it the stimulus of the jobs created by the war that created the economic boom that followed, or was it something different? Was it the programs that that Roosevelt put into place? So there was a lot of there was a lot of these kind of thought processes, and it's very hard in economics. Like I said, it's very hard to identify, and so because of that, I think in economics more than in any other science, we have a lot of alternative theories, and over years and years, those those alternative theories have been proven wrong, but some economists will come back and say, well, that was because of this. And it really isn't true. That was because of this. So if we don't do this time, it won't happen. Well, yeah, that's not really the case. So, so that's where we're at. That's where we have the problem. Is the issues there are clouded, and so I've said before, Keynesian economics has pretty much been proven wrong, and that is that the government can borrow an unlimited amount of money to continue to create dollars, create funds in the system, liquidity, that they can borrow an unlimited amount of money, and it doesn't impact other interest rates. It doesn't have an impact on business rates and bank rates and everything else. Well, I mean, some of this stuff you just logically step back and say, well, how can that be? Well, the theory is that there's an unlimited amount of money, that governments have an unlimited, because they can print money, that there's an unlimited amount of money. But we all know that if you print more money, that has to reduce the value of the money that's already out there. And if you have to sell debt to do that, you have to issue debt to do that. You're going to have to, as there's more debt out there and fewer people, countries, whatever, that are willing to buy that debt, that means your interest rate's going to have to go up to attract people to buy your debt versus other debt. Now, what is the investor looking at? Well, under Keynesian economics, that investor would only buy government securities, U.S. Treasury securities. So they're not impacted by the fact that, for example, there's commercial paper out there, or some sort of short-term bond debt out there that they would borrow. They're not impacted by that. I mean, let's face it. A lot of this stuff is being purchased for, investment, and it's a type of investment. It's a income producing investment. And so therefore it falls into a category, whether they're buying governments or they're buying U.S. government securities, treasuries, T-bills, all those kind of things, treasury notes, or they're buying Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac securities guaranteed by the government, or they're buying long-term bonds issued by a utility, secured by their plant and equipment. All of those things are just a spectrum, and the rate that you pay for that is largely going to be set by what the government's willing to pay, because right now the government's credit is considered to be the safest. Now, there's another fallacy with the Keynesian thought, is that assumes that the government's always going to have the same credit rating. As they borrow more money, are governments going to have the same credit rating? No. Does Spain, does Turkey borrow money internationally at the same rates as Germany and France? No, they don't. Why? Because they're considered to be high debt countries within the European Union, and they're risky. They're riskier because of that debt. And so therefore, it's harder to borrow money for them. They have to pay a higher rate. Most of the money that's being funneled to them is being channeled through the World Bank and other sources from other governments. But the net effect is they're paying more. Now, when that money goes there, Does the investor, for example, if I'm an investor, do I view an investment in Turkey, in the government, in their debt, to be better than an investment in, let's say, uh, Apple, Apple's bonds, or um, Florida Power and Lights bonds? Probably that's a depending upon what interest rate I'm getting. I'd probably rather have Florida Power and Light, but it's definitely going to be impacted on what Turkey's offering. If Turkey's interest rate is 23%, and I think that they're not going to go under, I might do that. But the other side of that is if FP&L is offering 10%, I might take FP&L. But if they're offering 2%, I'm not. So because credit is also a factor in interest rates. And we can't ignore that governments have credit ratings. And to the extent that those credit ratings deteriorate, it's going to cost more for them to borrow money. When it costs more for them to borrow money, it has an impact on other debt. It also has impact on the amount of debt. If a business has to pay more in taxes because their government is their government is going to have to pay that, to cover that debt that they've issued, then that means that that business may not have the liquidity to cover those taxes. And there's a difference between having income and liquidity, and we've talked about that before. Business is not like government. They can't issue dollars. They can't issue bonds to create dollars that the business can't do that the government can. So government can create its own liquidity by issuing bonds, borrowing money that it really doesn't have credit for, but it can borrow money, and once it borrows that money and pumps that into the system, then it has liquidity. It has the real cash to be able to do that, or the credit to be able to do that. Whereas business, on the other hand, does not. When its taxes are due, even if it may have made money on paper, but if it hasn't collected that money or it's reinvested that money in inventory, then it's not going to have the cash flow to pay its taxes. So it's going to have to borrow money. It's not borrowing money for taxes, because the bank will never loan you money for taxes, right? But you might be borrowing money on your inventory, borrowing money on your receivables. All of those things are legitimate. Right now, we're borrowing through COVID. All of that is money that's being borrowed, but it has an interest rate associated with it. Right now, because it's government money that's being borrowed, the interest rate is fairly low. But if you were borrowing that on the open market, you can bet today, for the types of loans that are going out today, business would be paying closer to 8, 9, or 10% for that money. That's how expensive the money that's going out right now, because their credit wouldn't allow them to borrow the amount or at the interest rate that they're getting by these government guaranteed or government made loans. You can't borrow money for 30 years at 3.75% in the business world. It hasn't been possible. Even the major corporations can't borrow that long term for those kind of rates. They're just not getting that kind of maybe some of the states are getting that. You might be able to go out on a 30 or 40-year bond with some of the states, but there again, that's a government subsidized, tax subsidized. So from a credit standpoint, that government has the ability to tax, especially if they're general obligation bonds. They have the ability to tax and raise that money. So what's happening is we have this situation that's come into play, that's out there, where we've got economists trying to evaluate what's going to happen, and they're trying to find the anomalies. And that's what bothers me right now, is that right now the economists who are in charge, Powell at the Federal Reserve and Yellen at the Treasury, are economists who support a theory that's failed, but they still believe it because it's the only way that they can support their agenda, their political agenda, which is not an economic agenda. It's a political agenda, and they're trying to make the economics fit the political agenda. The only way to do that is to pull out failed science. I mean, that's really the only way to do it, and then try to argue that failed science is wrong, that the experiment was flawed in some manner, and so if we fix it, it won't it won't happen the same way. And so this is a case of our federal government, led by people who have an agenda, are beating their head against a wall, expecting to get a different outcome than a huge headache, and they won't. They'll still get the huge headache. They might not. It might happen in the next administration, where they'll get blamed for it. But right now, so let me ask you this: you wake up the next morning from being out partying all night the night before, and you've got a horrible hangover. Is the hangover your fault that day, or is the hangover your fault the night before? So that's what we have with our current economic thinking. We know we're going to get a hangover. We're going to get a really, really, really bad headache, maybe to the point of being, passed out for some period of time. But why do we blame the headache? Why don't we blame the action that took place to cause the headache? We can't blame the action that takes place because of the headache. And that's what we're going to do. And that's what we're doing right now. And we have these economists who are trying to find a way to justify what they know is incorrect. They're trying to find a way to justify that so they can argue that we can continue to drink. And tomorrow, whenever that tomorrow comes, which will probably, it looks like at this point, be, would be our next, after the next election potentially, we're going to then blame the headache on the aspirin that we take, and that action that we took. So we're going to blame taking the aspirin for creating the headache. And that's what's happening economic thought right now. That's what we're being driven by with Yellen and Powell. That's all it amounts to. That's what it is. They can hang a lot of fancy terms on it. They can wine and dine you. They can treat you well. They can tell you how that next drink really isn't going to hurt you, or if it does, it's not going to impact you tomorrow. It's probably going to be years down the road. And actually it may really be good for you, because if you have enough of this alcohol tonight, you might build up a resistance to it in the future, so that you really won't get as drunk the next time. And that's the thought process. I mean, that is economics as it's being practiced today by many, many people that support the current political agenda. So think about it, people. You don't have to be an economist to understand this analogy, right? This is exactly the analogy that's taking place. You've got somebody that's continuing to give you a drink, and they're arguing, A, that this drink isn't going to affect you as much because it's got a mixer in it, and B, somehow this drink won't affect you tomorrow morning. It might not affect you for another few years by then, and you'll be in much better shape by then, so it's no big deal. Or, you know what? Maybe if you just take a couple of these drinks, you'll never get drunk again, because it will build up a tolerance in your body that will allow you to never, ever get drunk again. Now, we all know that's wrong, right? It can make some sense. It has some, oh, okay, yeah, maybe. Well, you're a lot smarter than me, and you've got these facts. There was this guy one time who actually didn't get a headache the next morning because he took another drink, and he had you know what he did is he actually took uh, a drink and when he did get drunk, but the next morning he had some tomato juice with an egg in it, and you know what? It wasn't that bad. So if we just do this now, let's say we just borrow bazillions of dollars and we pump it into the economy, whether people need it or not, and then we borrow money to pay for it, and we continue to borrow money to pay for it. But you know what? Maybe if we take a glass of tomato juice with an egg in it, it won't bother us tomorrow. Because that one guy, it didn't bother him. So now, is that a real valid sample? No, it's not. So this is what's happening. Unfortunately, this is what's happening with economic theory right now as we're dealing with this. Now, I'll tell you what some of the added drinks are. The mixer is well, this if we spend this money on infrastructure, if we spend it on infrastructure, it doesn't affect us as much. Yeah, it's a little bit of a problem because we're borrowing a bunch of money. But if we're borrowing a bunch of money to pay on stuff that's infrastructure, then the headache won't be as bad. We can justify some of the pain tomorrow because we bought stuff that's lasting at least as long as it's taking us to pay it off. Well, that's great from a theory standpoint. First of all, like I always tell you, when they tell you we're only going to tax the wealthy, the first question you need to ask is, what is infrastructure? Now, the interesting thing is you'd think that there would be an answer to that, right? But economically, there is really not. It depends on, and in accounting is the same thing. It depends on what you're talking about and how you're talking about it and how long you're talking about it over what period of time. So here's the thing. A bridge is infrastructure, right? A bridge is infrastructure. And it has a functional life, which is to move automobiles, right? So if I spend money on a bridge, I'm being told that that's not as bad. That's the mixer that's helping me not get this really bad headache the next day, because infrastructure is really good. And you've got a number of Republicans, hopefully not Republicans who understand economics, but you have a number of Republicans that are actively buying off on the strategy that if I spend it on roads and bridges, that it's infrastructure and therefore it's okay. It's okay to go way into debt for infrastructure. All right. Now, here's the problem. On the macroeconomic level, bridges, roads, military, all of those things are not infrastructure. At the government level, they're expenses. They are costs that we incur all the time. So it is not something that is, a kind of a one-time deal that increases our ability to work, makes us more productive. It does not. All it does is potentially either postpone those costs to a future period. We still have them. Every single day, the bridge here in Stewart is getting less valuable and is less safe, less new. And as a result of that, there's a cost associated with that. In accounting, we call it depreciation, but there is an economic loss. There's an economic cost to just having that bridge sit there every day, because every day it's getting older and is going to need to have more and more repairs. Now, we can put money aside to cover those repairs and pay those costs. That's an operating cost for the government. That's their cost, is to maintain those roads and maintain those bridges. Or I can build a new bridge right now. Okay, I can build a new bridge, and then it still is going to cost me every single day as that bridge deteriorates. So if I don't continue to put money aside to cover the cost of that bridge replacement or the costs when it needs to be replaced because it's getting less valuable and more and using up some of its value every day, if I don't put money aside for that, then when I spend the money to fix that bridge, is that an investment or is it a cost? See, that's the problem. It's a cost because we've already incurred the cost daily. Our highways have gotten worse every day. Our bridges have gotten worse every day. We have not fixed them. Every day that the government doesn't fix them, that's a cost of government that's not being paid. It's not an investment that they're not making. It's a cost that they're not paying. You understand the difference? If I'm a business, different story. At a business level, we think, oh, well, that's an investment. I bought a building. That building is going to, it's going to house my manufacturing facility for the next 40 years, and I'm paying it off over 30 years. So that's okay. But what is that building doing? Well, that building is not a cost for me from the standpoint, it's not a replacement of cost. It may be to some degree. I may have been leasing that facility before, but at this point, I'm getting better productivity because I now own the facility. It's exactly what I want. And the money from it, the value of it is going to me. But every day that I have that, there's a cost associated with it. So it's still going down. But for a business on the micro level, that investment that they make is an investment that they hope to produce a return or lower costs is what they hope, right? But at the macro level, it's not an investment because we have the cost of providing transportation. The federal government is deemed to be the party that's supposed to be taking care of interstate commerce and transportation and military. So we have those costs every day. That's a responsibility of the government. Them choosing not to pay it and waiting to pay it in a lump sum is not an investment. It doesn't save them. If we build a new bridge today, it doesn't save us. It really doesn't. It just catches up the stuff that we didn't do and allows us to postpone outflow of cash down the road. So see, it's not when we hear them talk about investment, it depends on what you're talking about. If they turn around and give money to businesses to use to buy equipment or to buy a building or to buy things like that are long-term assets, that would be an investment. So if the PPP loans or the EIDL loans were being used by businesses to buy equipment, to buy buildings, to pay off mortgages on buildings, if there is being used for all of that, that would be the government investing in business. And that would be, and now the government would be looking at that as for a return. They expect to get paid back plus interest, right? But at least it's an investment. That's a legitimate investment that they would expect a result of and a return. The government has just loaned trillions of dollars, so that you'll spend the money, not invest the money at the micro level. So now we have borrowed tons of money, not to make an investment in business, but to give them money to spend on salaries, to give them money to spend on working capital, to give them money to spend on anything that's going to go away. Basically, we've given them a bunch of money and we've told them spend it on whatever you want, however you want to spend it, but it can't be infrastructure. It's got to be expenses. You can spend it on inventory, you can spend it on, but it's got to be stuff that you're spending right away, right? So we told them, so that's not an investment. So the government can't argue that they invested in the economy or they invested in the business world. They did not, because the way they manipulated the money, it was designed to be spent. So the government spent trillions of dollars. They did not invest trillions of dollars. You'll hear people say, oh, they invested in the economy. They did not invest in the economy. Investing in the economy would have been providing money for capital, for new ideas, for research and development, for whatever. The government did invest in big pharma. They invested a lot of money in big pharma to come up with a vaccine. That was something that was designed to produce a long-term benefit, not a short-term benefit. It wasn't. It was research and development that was designed to stop or provide some kind of a method to either cure or prevent or reduce COVID. So that you can't make that argument. Now the government's trying to make the argument, well, if we spend the money at the government level on bridges and on roads and on maybe military, that for some reason or another, that is an investment. See, but it doesn't work the same, because you have to look at what your costs are, and the costs are for a government are maintaining roads, maintaining bridges, maintaining airports, maintaining the military. That's their job. That's what we pay them our current tax dollars for. We give them current tax dollars to pay for those current expenses. When they divert those tax dollars to something other than that, all right, that is not covering the cost that they've got to cover. They still have to cover it. All they're doing is postponing it. And they're choosing to spend money today that was supposed to be used to maintain. They're going to use it to postpone. Now, if I come in, let's say, and I build, let's say I go into a downtown and I go in there and I tear out all of the stuff that's there. I tear out all the houses. I tear out all the buildings. I tear out everything. I tear out the street lights. I tear out the sewer system. I do everything, and I put all brand new in. Okay. And then the logic behind that is, well, if I do that, I've got all of this new facility, and I'm going to be able to get more tax dollars because now this is more valuable, and I'm going to get more tax dollars, right? But that's not the case, because the government's job, once that's in there, is to maintain it. So unless the government is going to take the money that they get from the increased taxes, they're going to get that increased money from that. They have to basically use that over a period of time to maintain it. If they don't, all they're going to do is spend it again, and they didn't make any money. The city didn't come out ahead. You'll hear cities argue, if we just redevelop this area, if we redevelop, we'll put $30 million into the redevelopment of this area. That's an investment because we're going to get it back in real estate taxes. No, you're not, because by the time what you're getting from the real estate taxes is the money that the people there are paying for you to maintain this going forward and replace it when necessary. So 30 years from now, 40 years from now, if that all needs to be replaced, the government is going to have to pay for it again. It may be, and by then it's going to be more money than what they got in taxes over that period of time. So you see what I'm saying? They didn't really come out ahead. They actually came out behind. They put money into something that they didn't necessarily need to do in anticipation of getting more tax dollars, but those tax dollars are not being used. They're going to spend those tax dollars on stuff in between other than what they were supposed to spend it on, which is the infrastructure maintenance, not the infrastructure itself, but the maintenance that they just put in. So they're still going to incur that cost. They've just deferred the cost by down the road because they've done a lot of work now. And they're going to then defer it until later. But they still have to pay it. That's their job. The tax dollars that are coming, they don't make money off of that. That's not an investment that makes them money. The fact that a bunch of people come in and pay higher taxes doesn't mean that made more money, unless those higher taxes are going to be set aside to be used only in that area and only for that type of improvement, not for other things. So, and by the way, that is the real concept of a CRA. The whole purpose behind behind the Community Redevelopment Act and community redevelopment areas are to take and have government come in and take a blighted area, improve it, right? Then increase the tax base. But, and here's the key, the money from that tax base has to get spent back in that area to maintain it. And that's the concept there, that we can at least then afford to have a higher, to maintain a higher level of service. But it's not an investment. It's a cost, but we can afford the cost because we have increased the services that we're providing. We've made it, and if we do that, and we take those taxes and we don't spend them somewhere else, like in the general fund, but we rather spend them in the CRA area, then that can make sense. Not because you're making money, not because it's an investment per se, but what's happening is that you're at least taking a cost, paying it in advance, and then collecting the money and using it to maintain it, so that you're not borrowing money again, because that doesn't make sense. So if you get to the point where you're keeping the money and maintaining it, because the money is going back into that same area. But if you don't do that, if I spend it over in the general fund, I buy more garbage trucks, I buy more water and sewer treatment facilities or whatever, then all I've done is just postpone those costs. I've increased the amount of them because I've now put in infrastructure in that's more expensive than the infrastructure that was there. And I have, at the same time, just postponed the costs, but I haven't made an investment. Now, can I make an investment? Is there a way for a city to do that better? Well, it's not. We've just discussed, it's not necessarily to go out and build and put in infrastructure like roads and all of those kind of things in an area. That's not necessarily, that doesn't create value. It creates a cost. It creates a future cost that the government has to maintain. But if I have a place that already has sewer and water and street lights and all that, say I don't go in and tear all that down, I leave the 6 or 7 buildings that are there, and I leave them there, and instead of tearing them down, I encourage other businesses or other entities or businesses to build in that area, in the area that it's not built, the infill, they call it. So there's a lot next to my house, and that lot is smaller, but so I couldn't build my house on it, right? But if I now allow, as the government allows somebody to build a smaller house there, let's say I change the setbacks and I allow them to build a smaller house there, then that provides additional tax dollars without an additional cost of services. So at that point, the city has made an investment. They have made money for the city. That is a logical infill building in a city makes sense. Increased density in a infill building makes sense. There's a trade-off, of course. If I'm next door to that house that's now half my size, and it's half the cost, so now is that a comp for my house when I go to sell? Does it make it harder for me to borrow money? Is it going to create a lot of additional traffic in my neighborhood that I didn't anticipate? Those kind of things. Naturally, there's a political aspect to that, other than the economic aspect. And so, like I said, economic actions have many times political results. Somebody doesn't necessarily want that smaller house built next to theirs. They don't want 2 houses on the lot instead of 1. They don't want the mother-in-law apartment. But all of those things make sense from a city standpoint, because it does not increase the city's costs substantially, but it does increase their tax base. Same thing with CRAs to some degree, as long as that money goes back in. But typically CRAs are infill building, and that's why they make sense, because you're not having to necessarily pump all of that money back in. What you're doing is encouraging somebody to build up the property that they've got, to replace or fix the property they've got, make it more valuable. And that's really what CRAs are about. They're not about tearing down and building new stuff generally. They are about encouraging people to fix up what they've got and build in the space we already have, where we already have surfaces. That's why, especially in Martin County, if we want to preserve open space in the West, we have to utilize the space to the east that is supposed to be where the density is occurring. There's always going to be a political trade-off on that. We've seen that play out in the press relative to things like Costco and things like apartment buildings and all of those kind of things. So, but you have to understand economically what we're talking about. Now, when you look at the economics of government, like I said, it's a different economics. So when you listen to these guys talk about we're going to spend on infrastructure, and what they say is infrastructure, think about it. Was that their responsibility to pay anyway? Government's jobs are to pay long-term stuff. Military, roads, airports, railroads, all of those kind of things, they have the responsibility to pay and maintain most of those over the long run. Some of that's in the private sector, but most of it is the government's responsibility to maintain it, and that is a cost of government. It's not an investment by government. Governments do not invest. They have costs. And so that's what that is. That's the cost of government. Keep that in mind when they start talking. The other thing I'll say to you is that every investment that you make is a cost in the long run. And that's the problem, is that government is a long range, long term. So most of the things that they spend money on are not investments, they're costs. All they've done is postpone or front load. In the case of bridges and roads, that they've let them deteriorate to the point that now they have to fix them. So anyway, that's what we're going to talk about. I'm not going to be here next week, but I'll be back after that. So thanks for joining us right here on Treasure Coast Solutions every Wednesday, 9 to 10 o'clock, right here on WSTU Digital 1450. We're Martin County's Heritage Station.